The fourth lecture, Aspects of Translating Process. Lecture class plan. The first, description of the translating process. The second, the transformational model. The third, types of translation. The fourth, the main characteristics of translation. Description of the translating process is one of the major tasks of the translation theory. Here we deal with the dynamic aspects of translation, trying to understand how the translator performs the transfer operation from source text to target text. Psychologically viewed, the translating process must needs include two mental processes, understanding and verbalization. The translator understands the contents of source text, there is reduced the information it contains to his own mental program, and then he develops this program into target text. Types of translation. The first, literary translation. Literary translation deals with literary texts, works of fiction or poetry, whose main function is to make an emotional or aesthetic impression upon the reader. Their communicative value depends, first and foremost, on their artistic quality, and the translator's primary task is to reproduce this quality in translation. The second, informative translation. Informative translation is rendering into the target language non-literary texts, the main purpose of which is to convey a certain amount of ideas to inform the reader. However, if the source text is of some length, its translation can be listed as literary or informative only as approximation. A literary text may, in fact, include some parts of purely informative character. Contrariwise, informative translation may comprise some elements aimed at achieving an aesthetic effect. Within each group, further gradations can be made to bring out more specific problems in literary or informative translation. Two main types of translation. There are written and oral translation. The first, in written translation, the original can be read and reread as many times as the translator may need or like. The same goes for the final product. The translator can reread his translation, compare it to the original, make the necessary corrections, or start his work all over again. He can come back to the preceding part of the original or get the information he needs from the subsequent messages. The second, the conditions of oral translation impose a number of important restrictions on the translator's performance. Here the interpreter receives a fragment of the original only once and for a short period of time. His translation is also a one-time act with no possibility of any return to the original or any subsequent corrections. This creates additional problems, and the users have sometimes to be content with a lower level of equivalence. Two main kinds of oral translation. There are, the first, in consecutive translation, the translating starts after the original speech or some part of it has been completed. Here the interpreter's strategy and the final results depend to a great extent on the length of the segment to be translated. If the segment is just a sentence or two, the interpreter closely follows the original speech. As often as not, however, the interpreter is expected to translate a long speech which has lasted for scores of minutes or even longer. In this case, he has to remember a great number of messages and keep them in mind until he begins his translation. In simultaneous interpretation, the interpreter is supposed to be able to give his translation while the speaker is uttering the original message. This can be achieved with the special radio or telephone type equipment. The interpreter receives the original speech through his earphones and simultaneously talks into the microphone, which transmits his translation to the listeners. This type of translation involves a number of psycholinguistic problems, both of theoretical and practical nature. A different approach was used by Nietzsche, who suggests that the translating process may be described as a series of transformations. The transformational model postulates that in any two languages there is a number of nuclear structures which are fully equivalent to each other. Each language has an area of equivalence in respect to the other language. It is presumed that the translator does the translating in three transformational strokes. The first, the stage of analysis. He transforms the original structures into the nuclear structures. He performs transformation within source language. The second, the stage of translation proper. He replaces the source language nuclear structures with the equivalent nuclear structures in target language. And the third, the stage of synthesis. He develops the latter into the terminal structures in the text of translation. The lecture is over.